This is a topic that's very dear to my heart. For some of you, you know that I taught philosophy for a little bit. I did my grad studies in basically scholastic philosophy, focused on Aquinas. And then I also was in the seminary a little bit, so I feel like this is kind of a topic that ultimately underpins a big portion of what makes me tick as a Catholic, and what makes me tick as a Christian. A quote came to me earlier today that was from St. Catherine, and then later was uttered by St. John Paul the Great, later at a World Youth Day conference. It was, "If you are who God created you to be, you will set the world ablaze." So if we take this quote throughout our talk today, and we realize that God has a plan for each and every one of us, and by taking this light and putting it in our hearts and in our faith and in our actions, there's an inability to keep it to ourselves. Faith is active. There's nothing passive about faith. Nothing. You know, when Jesus is telling Peter to jump out of the boat, you know, how many of us would actually do that? Or how many of us would say, okay, let me check my pockets and put my phone, you know, on the side of the boat first and all of this stuff? Right? It's like, well, I'm not sure I wouldn't do that. Is it faith in God or is it faith in yourself? Where is that doubt actually coming from? So this talk is going to be split into several different parts. First, we're going to kind of focus on reason. Understanding the universe just as it appears to us. Understanding it through our senses. And also understanding it primarily through the lens of our own consciousness. We're kind of thrust into the universe without a compass, without an instruction manual. But there's something each one of us has in common. And there's something that tells us about God and about reality. So after moving there, we're going to move a little bit more into faith. Contrast that a little bit with reason. See what the role of faith is, particularly in regards to theology and our intellectual life. And after that, we're going to kind of bring it together and say, okay, what's the relationship of faith and reason? What's unique about the Catholic approach to having both of these at the same time? And why is it important that you foster both of these at all times? Towards the end of the talk, we're going to get a little bit more personal in terms of spirituality and kind of discuss what this means for your actual relationship with God and your relationship with the Catholic and Christian community around you. I mean, you can even broaden that, not even necessarily your relationship with the Christian community, just your relationship with anyone. All right. There's also going to be some kind of discussion towards the end, so we're going to kind of break into some smaller groups. So if there's anything that's kind of interesting to you, jot it down and bring up. These questions are more of a guideline for you to get conversation going. But if the Holy Spirit is bringing you to say something else to your small group, of course, jot that down and kind of discuss it. So I'm going to start with this quote of Fides et Ratio from John Paul II, almost 25 years ago to the date. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know truth. In a word, to know himself. So that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. So in preparing this talk, I was structuring it pretty much as I did, as I told you a minute ago. And I found that in doing some of my preliminary searching, it basically copied this Fides et Ratio. That's not because I was inspired by this, but probably because I have read that encyclical a dozen times. I mean, it is that good and it's that powerful. And it comes deeply from the core of St. John Paul II as well. Someone who was ultimately a philosopher, someone who is also just a humanist, who had a ton of emotions from growing up in the times of strife and warfare to the time of hope, of kind of a resurgence of the church and a springtime of the church. So if we look and take kind of a step back, we're going to kind of jump into our discussion of the understanding of reason. Before we get more into the philosophy, we can just kind of make an anthropological kind of observation, right? Every culture on earth has had some sense of the divine or some sense of otherness. It's just universal. As far back as you go. And so this makes us kind of question of like, why is this? What about the human condition wants to look outwards? Wants to find answers in something that's, not itself. And so I think it's a very modern kind of tendency to say like, oh, just look into yourself and like you'll find all the answers. You don't need external reality. It's like, well, wait a second. No, you're thrust into the world as it actually is. You don't have the ability to just choose your own reality. You can't close your eyes and just pretend that you can't eat, right? You are human. You are built the way that you are built. And if we also look internally at ourselves, you've probably found yourself asking questions about reality. Just, what is my meaning? What is my purpose? Where did I actually come from, and where am I going? Both of these approaches are extremely, extremely common in John Paul II's philosophy. He took greatly from basically scholastic philosophy, primarily through traditional Catholic metaphysics, but he also took from a new discipline of just phenomenology, of saying, looking at your own consciousness and saying, what can this tell you about the world outside, right? Is there this yearning inside of yourself that knows that you are fragile, that knows that you are weak, that knows that you are not eternal, and that there's some sort of spiritual component to yourself? And it yearns for something to fill that. That the world is spiritual, does not come as a surprise to most cultures and to most people. Right? I feel like it's a harder argument to make for materialism, that only what we feel and see and can touch and measure and all of this stuff is what actually exists. So okay, so none of this is like philosophical rigor. So we haven't really gotten anywhere, but we just know that, okay, it seems like there should be an answer. If we're asking the question, then there should probably be an answer, right? The alternative is, okay, jump way over to Sartre, right? And you're literally just vomited into existence, right? That's the vocabulary he uses. He's like, gosh, how dare I exist? How dare I have to have these choices? How dare I have to wake up every day and deal with my belief system? Right? So there's really three approaches. There's that extreme Sartre approach. Most people are not like that, right? Thankfully, it would be a pretty miserable world. And then there's the people that are actually examining their life. The unexamined life is not worth living. From Socrates, we've often heard that quote. There's some people examining their life and living in accordance with their belief system. Right? That's maybe another group, much bigger than that kind of very cynical group. But probably the largest group is just the group that doesn't really think about it. That just kind of goes through their life on autopilot. And just says, you know what? I'm busy today with my job and my friends and my other responsibilities. This is my life. It's just what I do on a daily basis. All right. So, jumping into philosophy. We're going to look at the proof for God's existence as kind of our example. You can kind of think of it as some sort of like philosophical or theological lab. We're going to kind of prod and poke and look at this experiment and say, what can reason tell us about this really important question? Okay, there's lots of other questions out there that are really cool and really worth answering. Life after death. We can talk about the immaterial of the soul. We can talk about the validity of religion, we can talk about the limits of science. All of these are awesome questions, and if you're here for 12 hours, we might be able to answer like half of one, right? So the question of for God's existence, we're first going to jump into Anselm. Okay. Anselm was in the 11th century, I believe, wrote a work called the Proslogion. Essentially a work that's essentially part prayer, part theological treatise, part philosophical treatise. It's a wonderful work, well worth reading. What we're going to focus on is his argument for God. A lot of you have probably heard this, so this is just a refresher. But it is called the ontological argument, and you'll see this argument pop up throughout history, again and again and again, because it's especially intriguing and because it's especially simple. You see it through Anselm. You'll see it later pop up for Ficino, who is obsessed with this, and then you'll even see it in Descartes. Right? Descartes has his famous cogito ergo sum, and then literally 2 paragraphs later, what is he talking about? He's talking about the ontological argument for God's existence. Okay. Now, was he probably paying lip service to it? Yes, probably. So the Jesuits didn't get angry at him, whatever. But it's an important argument. All right. So this is how it goes. So if there's a God, God is that which contains all perfection. Right? Just by definition. We're not talking about polytheism, we're not talking about mini-gods, we're not talking about some sort of kind of humanoid, kind of like weird conception of God or an idol or someone who lives off on a mountain or in the clouds or is a star. We're talking about God as we know God. God is just that which contains all perfection. It's a definition, just as if, geometry. You start from simple conceptions of a line, of a point, of parallel, things like that, and you get to really, really complicated stuff. I'm not going to make anyone do geometry here, but this is getting that direction. So, all right, God is that which contains all perfection. This is kind of the weird, tricky step. To exist is more perfect than to not exist. Right? We could word this a different way. We could say existence is an attribute of perfection. Kind of reflect on that, why that would be. It's kind of weird, right? A lot of times we tend to think in terms of like Platonic ideals about some like cloudy, fuzzy thing that exists, and if it doesn't really exist, it can't really have issues, right? But insofar as it's an idea, it can't really be perfect because it's just an idea. Okay. So Anselm is saying, let's sidestep this and say perfection is existing. It's not, to use a scholastic lingo for those who are probably familiar, it's not potency, it's act. It's not the ability to exist, it's actually existing. So now you start to see, why did I name this God if it is? All right, so the conclusion is pretty obvious. If God is that which contains all perfection, and perfection must include existence, then God, by definition, includes existence. Boom, right? I mean, it's that easy. It is that simple of a syllogism. Now, I'm not going to say, this syllogism doesn't have issues or errors or whatever. This syllogism is going to be torn apart by countless philosophers to this day. Okay? But it's also going to be built up by a dozen others. So the point of this discussion isn't to poke holes in this discussion or that discussion or Anselm's proof or Aquinas' proof. The point of this is to say that with simple reason, just basically 2 different premises, we've gone from not having a concept of God existing or not really being sure to God actually existing. I mean, can you get much more simple than that? Right. Now, let's move to Aquinas, who kind of takes a different approach. So as we said, Anselm has kind of this ontological argument. You could also say a priori or deductive kind of understanding. Aquinas is going to take a radically different approach, a much more Aristotelian, down-to-earth, a posteriori, inductive proof, right? That's a lot of words to say. All he's doing is using your senses to go out there and just pick some fact and prove God's existence from it, right? He's not going in some lab, putting, a suit on, doing all of this. He's getting in the world and kind of getting messy with facts about the world. Okay. So Aquinas actually rejects Anselm's proof. We're not going to go into why necessarily, but he says, you know what, I think I can do better. I can provide you these cosmological arguments for God's existence. He has 5 different ones. We're just going to briefly go over 2 and get back on track. So bear with me. So first, from motion, right? This is the one that we've probably all heard. It's not really that complicated. It's not that hard to understand. If we stack a thing of dominoes, at some point someone has to push that first domino, or the wind has to come and do that, or gravity has to do a weird thing where that domino goes. Okay, where the rest of the dominoes kind of fall over. Now Aquinas does make it a little bit more nuanced and says, okay, let's just assume that everything in the world has some component of being moved. Okay, if everything in the universe has some component of being moved, then there must be some immovable mover. Something who has the property of being able to move without the property of actually moving himself. So that's the first way. So the second way, it goes into causality. We're going to skip that one. What I'm interested in is more the third argument, the argument from contingency. So if we look into the world, we can notice that everything has some component of either being able to exist or not being able to exist. Right? If we look at ourselves, at some point we came into the universe. We didn't decide to come into the universe. We didn't bring ourselves into the universe. If we look at a mountain, we know that mountain came into existence at some other point. If we look at a planet, we can say the same thing. As far back as you can look, chronologically, everything is put into existence by something else. But more importantly, there's a possibility that it didn't need to exist. Why? Because it didn't exist at some point. So now let's actually do a geometric kind of proof here and do like reduction to the absurd, right? Let's just assume everything in the world, everything that you see, everything that you can touch, that you can think about, is actually contingent. What does that mean? Well, okay, if everything's contingent, then nothing would have brought it into existence. Okay, therefore, you end up with nothing, right? But we have stuff. Okay, this is where that proof, that reduction to the absurd, right? Stuff exists, right? This is like that philosophy of like when you're too deep into Descartes and stuff, and it's like, prove that the chair doesn't exist, and you're having this like deep discussion. And it's like that student that's like, what chair, right? It's like, wow, that student gets it. So stuff does exist. So if stuff does exist, there must be some non-contingent being. Some non-contingent. So what's another word for non-contingent? Necessary. Right? There must be some necessary being. All right. So if there's a necessary being, and all being flows from that, there is the necessary being who is being. Okay. It's really easy to get lost on this last one. Right? Because there must be necessary beings, God exists. How do you get from those two? So kind of reflect on those two and try to kind of massage out how you get to that conclusion. But long story short, we have already hit the title of this talk, God is. We suddenly realized God is being. right? So earlier, I'm going to bring in the cheese whiz. So we were talking about like cheese whiz and its economy and stuff, right? There is a nature of everything in the universe. Okay. There is a nature of what a fork is. Okay, and a fork has to have certain properties to be a fork, to have forkness. Okay, cheese whiz has to have some sort of cheese whiz property to be cheese whiz. Okay. But what properties does God actually have? Well, this is the weird kind of turn of argument or fate or whatever you want to call it of Aquinas, who says, guess what? God's essence is actually being. You know, step back. God doesn't have a nature apart from just being. Okay. Philosophy has all these really cool distinctions between like esse, which is fundamentally that which like holds everything in existence, what makes the thing actually exist. Essence, which is like the nature of the thing, and then ends, which is some like complicated combination of those two things. But everything has esse in the sense that it exists. Everything that exists has esse by definition. But nothing is esse except for God. Nothing is except for God. Now, okay, whoa, wait a second. This is exactly who God said he was at the burning bush. Huh. I mean, that's kind of weird, right? I mean, the fact that the very first principle that we get to in philosophy is the very name that God calls himself. Okay, I mean, maybe this isn't weird. Maybe this is just actually how it works. Maybe God's real identity is just that he underlies everything that exists. That the very fact that we're in this room, God is holding us in existence. That God's being permeates everything. All right, so if God's being permeates everything, this is like that smart philosophy student that's like, huh. All right, God permeates everything. God's being. So let me do the math. Evil, right? Evil exists out there in the world. If everything's good, God is good, God's holding stuff in existence, how does the problem of evil exist? Why is there evil out there? So let's look at this very, very briefly through two lenses. One, intellectually. Intellectually, I mean, honestly, we're not going to have any time whatsoever to discuss the ins and outs of this problem, other than to say it is a problem for philosophy and theology. It is hard. But the nature of sin, the nature of particularly original sin, is something that philosophers and theologians wrestle with in and out. Needless to say, as a matter of faith, if we move from the intellect more to faith, and we say, okay, the problem of evil, God is bringing a greater good out of this evil, so happy of fault, therefore, that we got Christ, like, golly. Like, we do the worst thing, we do the one thing God says not to do. Don't do that thing. We go do it. What does God do? He's like, oh, might as well go down there myself and literally die. Right? It's like, wow, that's kind of a guilt trip. Okay, so yes, just because you are going on this journey of reason and faith does not necessarily mean the journey is easy. It doesn't necessarily mean that the journey of the intellect towards truth is all that straightforward. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're trying to aim at God that you're going to be free from error. Think of the countless philosophers out there that have slightly misstepped. And oops, it's like, well, that's a heresy. Okay. All right, so back up. Thankfully, we have some like guardrails against this, and this is where theology comes in. So if we move from philosophy into theology, we suddenly kind of move from being the handmaiden to the queen of the actual sciences. Why is theology? I mean, this is not too difficult to kind of massage out, but why is theology ultimately the greatest sciences? Because one, its subject matter is the divine. Can you get any better than God? No. Right? Therefore, you can't get better than the coolest thing on earth, right? No, because that's God. So if we get to theology from its aim, we get to God, and then also from its first principles. So every science essentially has some sort of first principles. Philosophy has those from the senses or reality as such. We could have the natural sciences has like the scientific method for determining truth. Theology has essentially revelation and the Word of God. So we kind of take the two goalposts of the Catholic faith and theology. In terms of revelation, we typically mean different things depending on context. We can kind of mean natural revelation. And natural revelation is literally just creation, right? That is why people like St. Thomas Aquinas can go into reality and get God from it. If God is the source of everything, is the source of all being, God has even created our intellect to comprehend all beings, then it probably makes sense that we can ascertain or get some glimpse of God through our intellect. Okay, so we have some sort of artificial differentiation between like like intense revelation that's handed to us through sacred scripture and then revelation through creation and stuff like that. It's not for us in daily life. It's not in conflict. Okay, this is ultimately both a sign of God's existence, of God's power, of God's being. This is kind of a question for y'all to reflect on in the smaller group, but beauty is also one of these transcendentals, right? And so when you see a beautiful sunset in our mountain or sacred art, this also will point you in the direction of God. Yeah. So there's natural revelation, and then there's also, capital R, revelation, right? Which is probably the way that we talk about it more often in the Catholic faith. Where we talk about sacred scripture and we talk about tradition, again with a capital T. To mean like this is the actual practice and belief of the church handed down from the apostles. And then we've got a handy tool of the magisterium to interpret and to preserve the faith. Okay. So I like to think of this in terms of, if you have like one eye closed, it's really hard to judge, distance, because like your focal point isn't quite right. If you're trying to park with just one eye open, it's going to be a lot harder than just having both eyes open. And so having two gives you a focal point to direct you towards God. Right? Likewise, if you try to draw a line through a single point, you can draw that line any which way. But the second you draw that second point, there's a very clear delineation of where that line goes. Okay? You can't, yes, you can do a weird squiggly line. Let's just assume we have to do a straight line. Why? Because that's just the argument I'm making. So, from God's existence, we get different properties of God. Aquinas will go through these directly after he proves God's existence through the 5 ways. These will sound pretty familiar to those who have like read Plato or something about like the good, or like the form and stuff, about like unity, perfection, all of these different properties. And he'll go into like why, essentially arguments against them. Against immutability, and he'll disprove them, and so on and so forth. But I kind of want to jump to the next point, made in God's image. We've touched on this point a little bit, But it's something that's easy to forget, I think, about that God actually made us in his image. Now this has bearings and kind of foreshadowing towards Christ himself, since, you know, Christ is kind of the new Adam, and in a sense we're kind of becoming Christ, right? But there's a deeper sense of it, just philosophically and theologically speaking, about our intellect being able to comprehend truth. Right, so I was reading Aquinas, and there's this really interesting kind of part of Aquinas where he's like, God is the most intelligible being in existence. And you're like, great, awesome, right? Like, great, yeah, he's the most like easy to understand. Well, no, he's not the most easy to understand. He's the most intelligible in himself. Meaning the only being who really understands God in his entirety is actually God. Why? Because if God is actually eternal and actually infinite and actually all of these properties, and we are finite and limited and sinful and so on and so forth, you know, how are we actually going to hold the infinity of God? I mean, short answer, we aren't, right? We cannot hold the object of God in our mind. I mean, Aquinas literally uses those words. We see God through his essence, not directly his essay. So again, we're getting a little bit philosophical here, which is, okay, it's kind of touch and go, I get that, but there's a point to it. We approach God through what we can sense and what we can rationally get to. Okay? We don't get God in his entirety. That's beatific vision, ultimately. The goal towards the end of our life. Now, will we still even hold the entirety of God in ourselves? No. We'll still kind of be reflecting it, right? It's kind of like, you know, getting a sunburn in the sun. It's just, it's impossible not to if you're just not putting on sunscreen and you're literally right in front of God. Okay, so we're made in the image of God. And we've realized that reason is a tool and that faith is a tool towards understanding God, right? Reason will get us that God exists, but reason will not necessarily get us the concept of Christ, right? We can't fathom out of nothingness Christ, right? If we put someone in a room, never told them about Christ, they're not going to get to Christ. They're not going to come up with that story. Now, the earlier Christians are way stronger on the side of just, you know, pure faith, because they're out in the field preaching God's word, doing the good, preaching the gospel. Okay. So you kind of get concepts that later are kind of seen as not as good, like Tertullian, for instance. Tertullian has kind of a lot of witty phrases about like the blood of martyrs is like the seed of Christianity and so forth. But he also has this concept of like, I believe because it's absurd. Like, Credo Crede absurd, right? It's like, wait a second. You went way too far to the other side. Yes, it's an absurd story, but that's what actually makes it revelation. That's what actually makes it faith. This isn't a story that we just kind of randomly came up with and decided, let's go with it. This is actually the faith, the actual reality. It drives me up the wall when people are like, you know what, my kids, I'm not going to baptize them. I'm not going to bring them into the faith. I'm not going to share religion with them. I'm like, okay, are you not going to tell them that like the sun exists? Right? If God is actually reality, then what's the difference in not sharing religion with a child? Right? Versus a scientific fact. We tend to think of intellectual assent, so like actually agreeing or taking in a fact and being like, I agree with this fact, of like some sort of intellectual or scientific principle. Of like, you've given me a fact, like I'm good. But people give you facts all the day, all the time. On your phone, there's just stuff buzzing all the time, telling you information. And we've gotten to a point where we tend to take a lot of stuff with skepticism. Of like, I don't know, is this, fake news? Right? Just because someone gives you a fact doesn't make it a true fact, right? So essentially Aquinas is saying, in order to have belief, whether this is a scientific belief, scientia, or whether this is a belief of faith, fides, you still need the assent of your will to push your intellect to actually accept it. At the end of the day, you still have to accept truth, wherever it comes from. There's a component of faith. There's a component of faith in science. There's a component of faith in your relationship with others. There's a component of faith when you turn on your car and you drive here that will actually get you here, right? Not everything is super rational, and the idea that we can just kind of entirely rationalize or treat existence like some sort of syllogism is not realistic. We don't have time or the resources to be able to set out every action. Again, we are thrust into existence. There's a couple more points here and we'll get to discussion. So mystery. This very much relates to mystery. Reason is not going to do away with mystery. We're not going to wake up one day and be like, you know what? We solved the problem of evil. File that away. And this would always frustrate people, students, when I would teach philosophy about like, wait, what's the point of philosophy? Like, you're still asking the questions that Socrates did. Like, wow, you must be really bad at your job. Like, maybe the big questions of existence and such are actually worth maybe looking at again and maybe getting some depth from. And maybe they're mysteries because at their core, there's something infinite, something infinitely true, something infinitely beautiful, and something infinitely good. That as much as we pull from it, it's gonna keep giving us more. There is no mystery on earth you can exhaust that has to do with God. God's existence is bountiful. God's goodness is bountiful. God's beauty is bountiful. This really affected me years ago when I was watching a video of Richard Dawkins and they were interviewing him. This is part of the discussion questions. But they said, all right, what happens if you're wrong? He's an atheist, a very popular atheist who has tons of arguments against the existence of God. And they said, you know what? Let's just say like you missed something and you were wrong. And you end up at the pearly gates and you're there, you enter and like you see God, like what would you say to him? They're like, well, the first thing I would ask like which God he is. Is he like Zeus or Jupiter or whatever? Like what is your actual name? Okay. That's we could talk about that another time. But the second question I think interests me more. He said, why did you take such pain to hide yourself? Ouch. Right? For someone who's actually living their faith, it's so obvious. You can't go outside and see that beautiful sunset. You can't go inside your community and hear about the good news. You can't read a book and see that there's some inkling of God's truth underlying every single truth out there. So what do you mean that God is hiding himself? Right? And this gets into a whole mystery of free will and determinism. Really interesting questions about how God can both know what we're actually going to do and still have free will. Like, But at the end of the day, it's our job with faith and reason to see God as much as we can in everything that we do. To make everything that we do essentially a prayer. A broader definition of truth is just that which like mirrors reality. And if God is the ultimate reality, then that's truth. Goodness, we have ethical actions, being good. So all of this has implications for the way that we live our actual life. So sharing the faith. This goes back to an earlier point, but a lot of people don't necessarily take out a pencil and a piece of paper and say, let me use reason and try to figure out if Christianity is true or not. That's not often the way that ultimately people kind of come into the fold. Often it's more kind of that, Augustine's kind of wrestling with the faith in that sense of emptiness. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So what's the point, right? What's the point of doing Catholic philosophy if we can just like take the easy lane, the fast pass kind of toll road to theology? In fact, what's the point of even doing anything other than theology, right? Should we like be racing to brush our teeth and then like get back into theology and get back to a book or something? Or not even theology, spirituality, run to the chapel, right? But why do monks themselves have this concept of like ora and labora? Us spending, half their day in prayer and half of it actually doing tasks. That's a question certainly to reflect on. I think one thing I would say is that Jesus himself was a carpenter. Right? Jesus did certainly have his times where he would kind of go up to the mountain and pray to the Father, lead others in prayer, teach them how to pray. But day to day, Jesus is our best example for how to live life, right? If we read the book, The Imitation of Christ, that's obviously a very great manual. If we read the Gospels, that's obviously the best form of revelation. We've got a lot of resources out there. But in our day-to-day life, not all of us can actually be, 100% in adoration or 100% helping the poor and the needy and the homeless and all of this. At the same time, we have a concept of the apostolic life and the spiritual life and the intellectual life. We have to balance all of these in a way that God calls us to. That's going to be personal for each of us. That's going to be a conversation that we have had with God and that we will continue to have with God. Just a couple more minor points. We often hear it pointed out that knowledge leads to love. Like, if you know God, you're going to love God more. And, I've always been like, well, yeah, sure. But I've been reflecting on this, the last couple weeks or so, and I really struggled with this. What does it actually mean, right? Why does knowing God more actually lead to love of God more? And we're going to kind of go back to kind of the production of the absurd, but this isn't so much an argument more than a statement. Kierkegaard's Love and Trembling has a really good comment on this. He essentially says, if you don't know God, but you find yourself praying, I'm paraphrasing here, if you find yourself praying and you don't know God, then what are you actually doing when you're praying? I mean, you're just thinking about yourself, right? There's no sense in thinking about God, or you may be thinking about your work or about someone else, but you're certainly not thinking about God. You have to have some knowledge of God to actually have an authentic conversation with God. So he says, those who actually know God and pray are actually thinking about God. So it's in reflecting on these attributes of God, whether they're the more kind of philosophical ones like unity and oneness, or the more personal ones about God being love, there's something to be gained for our prayer life and our spiritual life, and looking in that attribute and connecting that attribute to God. we've mentioned this time and time again. There's not one route to God. Right? There's the transcendentals, truth, beauty, goodness. But there's other ways as well. The community that we have here, the community elsewhere that we may have, our church. If God is being, then He permeates everything that we have in existence. And if our hearts are open to it and we have the right attitude of faith, then we're going to be open to that relationship with God as well as that intellectual journey to find God. Right. This all kind of goes back to, I think, one of the most powerful phrases of philosophy / theology / whatever you want to call it, of just Anselm saying, fides pueris intellectus, faith seeking understanding. It's like, I am going on this journey of the intellect because I believe. And he also has a complete opposite as well. Of just, you know what? I'm going through this journey of the intellect to ultimately arrive at faith. They're so intricately linked that they make each other stronger. Right? To go back to the original phrase that we started with, they are the two wings, right? You can't fly with one wing. You ultimately need both the faith and reason to approach God. And that's it.
Awesome.